Okay, welcome to your first part of your culminating activity. You're going to click on the Google Doc up in the top right hand corner and you'll get this document here. This is your chance to get your creative juices flowing for the second part of your culminating activity. So we're going to start in here by first just typing in our name, and then we're going to describe what's going on, both using a story and using math. So you're going to look at this graph. First, it's important to recognize that time is along the bottom here and distance from home is along the side. There are no measurements in either of these, so you could be describing something in hours or minutes or seconds, and your distance from home could be meters or kilometers or whatever. This is going to be up to you. But what you're going to need to do is describe each section of this scenario. Okay, I'll do the first one for you as an example, and then you're going to fill in the rest on your own. So, for example, in this first part, I notice the graph is going up, so the distance from home must be increasing. So first, you're going to talk about your story. So the story is, I went to visit my bestie Carl. I was so excited. I started running. All right, so I've decided that's my little story. Now I have to explain because of this story, how did it influence the graph? So I'm going to say something like, I went away from home, so the graph goes up, and the line is steeper because I was running. So I have described the direction of the graph, so it's gone up, and the steepness because I was running. Okay. Now you may choose a very different scenario. Maybe you're going to talk about a driving. Okay, so you drove really fast, and therefore you might be talking about, your story might be a little bit different, but the math should sort of represent the same thing. And then you're going to go on from B to C. What happens in this scenario? I'm not going to tell you what to fill in your story, nor am I going to tell you what the graph is. That's your job. Okay, and then you're going to do this for each section of the graph to describe a little story and describe the math. And this will be your first part of your culminating activity. When you're done, make sure you push the turn in button up here and you'll be finished part one. Good luck. For the second part of this culminating activity, I want you to have some fun and be creative. So what you're going to do is create a video or a cartoon strip or some sort of story depicting a relationship between time and some dependent variable. You can pick whatever dependent variable makes sense for your story. Once you have your video or your cartoon or your story, you need to create a graph showing the various things that happened in your video or your story. Next, you'll write a brief background sentence or two setting the scene for your story, and then finally you'll create a table describing each section of your graph, just like you did in the first part of this culminating activity. So I'm going to show you an exemplar of exactly what I'm talking about for this little project. Okay, so what I'm going to want you to do is just watch this video, and then you'll see a sample write-up. So here's the video. All right, so there's a fun little video of me going back and forth by a basketball net, and I can write a little story about that. So once I have that video set, or maybe if you don't want to do a video, you want to draw a story or something like that, it's totally up to you. But once you have that story set, you're going to make a graph much like I did here. So you see, I've done this by hand. It's totally fine to do it by hand. You don't need to type it up or anything like that. You can get a very accurate graph. All right, and I've done a graph that describes everything that happened in this video. Okay, so if you remember, I started far away and then I went towards the basket, but then stopped and then backed up, stopped, and then went down and dunked the basket. Okay, so here's my little story, just a very brief thing saying, setting up the scene, and then I go into the graph. So this all happens before the graph starts, and then I'm describing the graph. And you'll see that this part looks just like culminating, or the first part of your culminating activity. So each section is labeled A, B, C, D, and so forth, and then you describe it. So at the beginning, my story says that I'm sizing up the defense. So I'm just stopped and I'm looking at what's going on. And then, of course, I explain the math. So the graph starts 6 meters away from the basket and is flat because I'm not moving. Okay. And then, of course, I drive to the net. So that means the distance from the basket decreases. Okay. And you'll see that I describe that in the graph. And then I go off and do off. Now, I haven't finished the whole idea, but you get the idea of what you need to do. So what you need to do is produce either a video, or if you don't want to do a video, you want to do a story or a cartoon strip, that's fine. Then produce the graph that describes what's happening in your story and explain the math that's behind it. Now, a couple of helpful hints as you move on to do this final little project. Think simple versus difficult. You'll notice that my graph is a very simple scenario. I'm not talking about the whole game. I'm talking about 13 seconds in the game. Something simple is easier because I really want to see that you understand the basics and the math behind it versus some really complicated story. Pick a dependent variable that's easy to graph. Money earned and spent are not good ones. So I've seen lots of people tell about stories about how I started with $100 and then I bought an $80 sweater and then you have 20. Well, if you have that, you can't graph that because it goes immediately from 100 down to 20, and there's no increasing or decreasing slanted lines. Okay, so think about that egg graph in the Desmos activity. It's not very exciting. So make sure you pick a dependent variable that makes it a little bit easier to graph. Stuff like distance is a good one, water level, so forth. Be sure you know the distance between the difference between distance from and distance traveled. So you notice my graph, I have distance from the basket. If you're talking about distance traveled, your graph can't go down because you can't untravel something. Okay, so make sure you understand that, and make sure your scale is realistic. You'll notice that I didn't pick kilometers and hours. My graph is in meters and seconds. Kilometers wouldn't make sense in this, so make sure your scale is realistic. On the assignment, you also see the rubric that will be used to assess your thing, where you'll see there's stuff about knowledge and skills, making sure your sequence is correct and you got accurate graphing techniques. You have some problem solving application, and then of course a big part on the communication, how you described all the events in your graph. Okay, so that is the second part of this Call Me activity, and will be how we wrap up this final unit. So I wish you the best of luck, and we're all looking forward to seeing your creative final solutions.